So good day to you. I'm Professor Lala Sriram from the NIAS Literary Arts and Heritage Forum. And while we've been also looking a lot at heritage science through the forum, we're also now expanding into these very exciting topics of scientific heritage and business heritage. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Shivanand Kanavi here today, who's already given us a very exciting lecture on the quantum centenary. And Professor Shivanand Kanavi is a very eminent business and economic and science historian, and has also trained in theoretical physics from numerous IITs and also in the US and so on. And for several years he was also vice president in the TCS and has a lot of rich expertise in various domains. And he's also quite a Renaissance personality. He also lectured for us in the past on the history and philosophy of the Lingayat movement. So, and I think it's very important to document also the various other histories in modern times, the making of modern India, the industrial houses and so on. So, and of course NIAS here has been seed funded by one of the most eminent business houses here in India, the Tata Group, and TCS has also been a very important sponsor for us in the heritage science program for archaeomaterials, which they seed funded over many years. And it's also thanks to all those initiatives that we've also got a major Anusandhan Research Foundation grant. So this gives us double pleasure here to have Professor Kanavi talk about the Bombay Plan, 1944 to 45, in the economic history of modern India, talking about the Tata-Birla plan and so on. And I'm very glad to see also our director, Professor Sailesh Nayak here, and other faculty. Thank you very much.
After a gap of almost 3 years, I'm visiting NIAS again and meeting Dr. Nayak after again 3 years, and had a few minutes with him and tried to. The journalist in me doesn't go away. Whenever I see some expert in any topic, I try to quiz him to understand, increase my own even superficial understanding of whatever they're doing or they're involved in leading. And today, this topic, I've been talking about it for last 1 year. I gave several talks in IIT Hyderabad, IIT Kanpur, BITS Pilani, and even to the public in Harvard, Karnataka state government's higher education academy and so on this topic, on what is this Bombay Plan and what has been its significance in the economic and business history of modern India. Because as you can see, the year in which it was published, so last year was its 80th anniversary. And so how come a 80-year-old plan, why are we digging it out? We are not in economic archaeology to bring out some plan, some proposal, some report. So many plans, proposals, sessions are given by individuals, organizations, however eminent they are. But do they really have any effect on the society, on the economy? Only 40, 50 years later we will come to know whether any part of it was implemented, how well it was implemented, and what effect it had. Because I believe, though I am not a professional economist, so what little economics I know, which has to do with production, distribution and consumption of goods and services. And that goes on spontaneously. That does not really depend on who is the finance minister, who is the prime minister, who is the government of India. And even the trends and things, to discern trends, it takes a lot of study, empirical study. And there's nothing to do with ideology, nothing to do with our biases, to extract some pattern from it and some direction in which it's going. Because everybody acts out of individual choice. You buy something, why do you buy something? Because you can afford it, because it is useful to you. That time we don't worry about where it was made, who made it and all that, right? So policy prescriptions, plans, etc. have a very limited impact on the behavior of actors. And here we are talking about today 1.5 billion actors. Once this census is completed, we might come up with a new figure. So far we keep saying 1.4 billion, and that was done 15 years ago, right? But still, I think, and so do few economists and public policy experts, including Dr. Manmohan Singh, that this had a very tremendous impact on independent India. But however, we have not heard its name so much. It was widely discussed, debated, reviewed in the international press. Economists wrote about it, Foreign Affairs wrote about it, all the international journals wrote about it, Financial Times followed it and critiqued it, okay, and so on. And of course, all the Indian press wrote about it. Counter plans were also proposed. The leftists made a counter plan called People's Plan. Gandhians proposed a Savoya type of plan, as a counter to this and so on. But afterwards, after this 44-45, and this was published, by the way, in a small booklet in two parts, part 1 and part 2, and each one costing about ₹1 or 2, and sold publicly. So it's not a conspiracy, it's not a secret document I am unearthing. And it was well discussed in the 40s, and there is a background to it also, we will come to that. But we all forgot about it. Till 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 2019 was the 75th anniversary of this, and 2 books came out about it. This was one written by Professor Medha Kudaisia. She is a JNU product, PhD from JNU, excellent historian who is now professor in National NTU in Singapore, an excellent historian. And in fact, I learned a lot by reading her extremely well-researched biography of G D Birla. Very well documented, researched biography of G D Birla. Because I didn't know much about G D Birla at all, whereas Tatas are known and so many books have been written about it. And she published this book, Tryst with Prosperity, Indian Business and the Bombay Plan of 1944. This was published in 2019 on the 75th anniversary. And the other one was edited by Sanjay Baru, Dr. Sanjay Baru, who is an economist, journalist, etc., think tanker, and Lord Meghnad Desai, who many of you might have heard. He was the director of the London School of Economics and so on. And this is a collection of papers on the Bombay Plan and various aspects of Bombay Plan and so on by number of economists, even corporate executives, historians and so on. And whereas the first one is a single author book written by Medha, Professor Medha. And this also has the entire Bombay Plan in the appendix. Okay. Of course, Bombay Plan is available on the internet. You can download its digital edition, digitized version. So, after 75 years, this again, was picked up. Now, why is that? How come if we are talking about such an important plan and such a consequential plan, that it took 75 years to rediscover it and discuss it again? So, I'll come to that because practically speaking, Bombay Plan became the Government of India's plan. So later, nobody had to refer to the Bombay Plan, or at that time popularly also called Tata-Birla Plan. Okay, because R D Tata and G D Birla were 2 of the 8 authors of this plan. Okay, now just to background to it, that the authors of this, where did they come from? What is their background? Our Indian business class in general. In the pre-colonial India, we find a lot of entrepreneurs, traders, and so on, and traders with vast international networks. We have found them, Jagat Straits and so on and so forth. Even people having, branch offices till Yemen, in Aden to Malacca Straits. So Indian traders, large moneylenders, financiers, trade financiers, people who are financing the Maharajas, people who are financing the wars, medieval wars, all that. Because no war can be waged without somebody financing it. Okay? So all these things, they were famous. In fact, if you read Dalrymple's book, Anarchy, he talks about how there were these big states who even financed the East India Company. They financed Clive and so on for the, to getting rid of Ardeshir Dalal and so on. The Jagat Seth family in around Calcutta, they financed, they invited the British to come and, get rid of Ardeshir Dalal and so on. So, the history is not very black and white, and what Indians have done and are not done, and what the foreigners have done and not done, etc. But anyway, so what the point is, Indian entrepreneurship, trading, trade financing, so hence, in a sense, a banking network, right? All this was quite substantial. In fact, in Jahangir's time, there is a thing has been found. You can say today it will be called a draft, bank draft, of 10 equivalent to 10 lakh rupees of that time, of Jahangir's time. And at that time, even Bank of England could not do it. Bank of England was nothing in the 1600s, right? Elizabethan age. So anyway, but they turned into industrial capitalists after seeing the industrial revolution and the development of technology, development of the factory system, the management system within the factory, both the technological aspect and the management aspect, etc. So that really attracted them. So then the question started that we have the money, though India was getting impoverished, there were enough rich people in India too. Okay? But they didn't know and they wanted to be, you can say, global entrepreneurs. They were not limited by any boundaries, political or geographical boundaries, because they had a history of trade, Southeast Asian trade and West Asian trade and so on. But the colonial rule was restricting them. So many attempts were made. For example, the shipping was very important. So one of the first things the British did was control shipbuilding and shipping. Right? And so in 1907, 1908, 3 entrepreneurs tried to set up a shipping business. The Tatas and the Tagore family in Bengal and a person from Tamil Nadu, Chidambaram Pillai. And the British made sure that all 3 of them went bankrupt. Okay, and much later in 1927, Walchand, Rachand, etc., struggled to set up what became known as the India Steam Navigation Company, the first Indian-owned shipping company. Again, it could not do international trade, they were banned, Indians were banned, they used to do some coastal shipping type of thing. So that is the only shipping company that to 1927. Whereas 1907, all these attempts were made, they were crushed. So, like this, I mean, you can give many examples, you have heard about all the stories of how Jamshedji Tata had to struggle to even set up with his own money and other donations the Indian Institute of Science or the Tata Steel in Jamshedpur. Nearly 2 decades he had to run around to get permission. So, this restriction by the colonial rule not only was pauperizing millions and millions of people, the peasantry and small traders and artisans and so on, but it was also restricting the entrepreneurs and the businessmen. So, but within that they tried to do whatever they could. So they were also yearning for independence. While they liked the British management techniques, they even liked the British state. First time I said we had a centralized state, and standing army and this and that, and all that thing which the previous period of almost 100 years was chaotic in India. After the collapse of the Mughal Empire, soon after the death of Aurangzeb, there was total chaos in India. Anarchy, you can say. Broken up, the Mughal Empire broke up, every governor of Aurangzeb declared himself independent, the Nizam of Hyderabad, the Nawab of Awadh, the Nawab of literally Mughal empire shrank from Aurangzeb had expanded the Mughal empire to double its size from Akbar's time. Okay? But at what cost? Not only he terrorized vast populations all over India, he ruled for 50 years and every year he went on an expedition. So he was the most unpopular, forget the religious angle, as a tyrant, and because every war meant devastation for the peasantry. Wherever his standing army of lakhs of people was marching. So there were these basically peasantry fighting back, whether in the Jat area, Sikh peasantry, Maratha peasantry and so on. Wherever his armies went, if they could get leadership, they were trying to resist it through these things. So he was the most unpopular leader, but he had expanded. He was ruthless and he had expanded double the size of the Mughal empire. But he had overextended himself, so the moment he died, many of his governors declared themselves independent. Okay? And in that chaos, and then the Marathas tried to stabilize it. The Scindias and Holkars and all these people, they became literally the power behind the throne in Delhi for some time, till the British finished them off and then finished them off in Pune after finishing off Tipu. So one by one, British chose all these resistance and finished it, right? And that time there was quite a chaotic situation. So when the British came up with their methods of governance, their statecraft and state, and the well-to-do in India, the Maharajas, the traders, and these people, they are well-traveled. They were well-traveled. They used to visit Europe. They used to visit the industrial exhibitions in Europe. They used to visit Japan and so on. For example, you must have heard about it that Jamshedji Tata met Swami Vivekananda when both of them were in the same ship which was going from Japan to the United States. Okay? So this is, and then he recalled it in saying that I had mentioned to you that I want to establish this Tata Institute of Science. Okay, and I need some help and various things like that. And subsequently, that dream came through a few years later when the Maharaja of Mysore and one of the Maharanis donated this nearly 1,000-acre land in Malaysia for the establishment of ISC. And that was all despite the opposition from the Viceroy at that time and all that, right? So, the Indian entrepreneurs had their own dreams. The revolutionary and segments and who really wanted to overthrow the British rule and all that, who had already had the memory of 1857, that was also growing. And the more elite gathering in the form of Indian National Congress had also come into being. Indian National Congress, in fact, initially was funded by the Tatas in Bombay. So Jamshedji Tata was the power behind the throne of the Indian National Congress, but he never came forward. He had established already a club, a discussion club of the Indian intellectuals called the Ribbon Club in 1882 itself. And even Firoz the Dada-Bhai Naoroji and all, they were close associates of him. And later Dada-Bhai Naoroji went to England and became the first elected Asian for the House of Commons. And so on, okay? And he wrote the first book on the economic exploitation of India called The Causes of Poverty in India, the un-British rule in India and so on, okay? So, the Tatas and the other businessmen around them and so on in Bombay, they had to survive. And in the colonial system, so they were also in constant discussion and in a sense collaboration and consultation with the Viceroy and governors, and at the same time they had their own aspirations for an independent India. And similarly in the Ahmedabad mill owners, Sarabhais, Lalbhais and so on, who had set up chemical industry, textile industry. Then there was the Calcutta where D Birla emerged as a leader. He established the first Indian-owned jute mill there, and if you look at the minutes of the Jute Mill Owners Association, they just hate him, the British, who were the earlier jute mill owners. Who is this guy who comes like a bull in a china shop and all that, and is so aggressive and is doing all this and all that, okay? People like Tagore's, I think he was grand uncle or grandfather, Dwarkanath Tagore, he was one of the founders of the Bank of Bengal, Commercial Bank of Bengal, which later became Imperial Bank, which later became State Bank of India in 1806. Right? And the first, you can say, modern capitalist enterprise was established between one East India Company, Ustanbi Board, Tata, nepotism you can call it. So corruption was not just an Indian phenomenon. East India Company encouraged it and practiced it. So most of the East India Company officers, their nephews and Bhanja Modija type of thing, they were all into business and they were being given either they were entrepreneurs or they were getting contracts from the government. So initially that's why we don't see many British monopoly capitalists, British companies which are famous there coming into India and investing but a lot of British officers and some relatives of East India Company and some other smaller ones establishing European businesses in India, whether it is Bombay, Calcutta or elsewhere, Kanpur, etc. But so the first such thing was set up in 1830s and 40s. It's called Tagore Kar. That was the first what is called a managing agency, which is you can say modern enterprise. Which had something like the precursor of the joint stock company, and today we have public limited companies and all that. So there is a whole history of managing agencies and all that, and give a reference to that. So this is the background of the evolution of this. But with the First World War, this took off. Because now British wanted, they were cut off, supplies from Europe, and British Indian Army was a backbone of the British Empire. It's the Indians who fought for the establishment of British Empire in India and elsewhere. In Afghanistan, in Persia, in Burma, and then in the World Wars also. Okay? So, British Indian Army, supplies for that were needed. So, any industrialist who can become a supplier to the army and to the government and so on during the war years was allowed to establish his business without much problem. Okay, and though he had to sell it to government at various fixed rates and all that. So that is the time you see the rise of Indian business, the First World War. And so after the First World War, immediately you start seeing a clash happening in the politics and in the economic front between Indian business and the government of India, the British government of British India. Okay, and then we see the growth between the two wars in the 20s, 30s, and by 40s, you see dramatically changed equation. By 1944, 62% of large-scale production was owned by Indians. Market also, this estimated 73% of the market of products of large-scale industry were owned by Indians. This is 1944. And foreign banks, which had 70% of the deposits in 1914, had been reduced to only 17% deposits by 1940s. Rest were all Indian-owned banks, Indian insurance companies and so on had come up. Okay? And if you look at even the import figures, imports had fallen drastically. So that means Indian industry itself was able to satisfy most of the consumer goods required for India. Okay, so the imports fell, imports of cotton, imports of, textiles, imports of chemicals. You see the graph and I can provide you the charts of that, how it progressed from the beginning of the 20th century and by 1940s. So majority ownership, majority control and all that had come to the Indian business hands. And by 1944, the three biggest groups at that time were the Tatas, the Birlas and the Almay. And the three, their assets at that time were about 600 crores, the three groups together. And the three biggest European companies had only 74 crores. So even if you look at the power of the weight had shifted to the Indian businesses. So this is the background, and now they were all ready, you can say, to get independence. And how are we going to manage this economy? Should we what we want to retain from the British legacy and what we want to do on our own. So there is a big churn, and this churn was happening at the political level within the Congress, The discussion started in the 1929 session of the AICC, and then the Karachi sessions and so on. It went on till 1936-38, and in 1938 when Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was the president, he formed the first subcommittee under the Congress to produce a plan for the development of India. And he made Jawaharlal Nehru as the chairman of that committee. Vishweshwaraya was there, several others were there, and then several businessmen were also there in that. That is the Congress Planning Committee formed in 1938. And then of course the war came, and so that committee could not meet, and then nothing was happening. So then G D Birla took the initiative, and G D Birla had become very active from Calcutta, where he had migrated as a youngster. He not only fought in the jute market, then he became an industrial house owner. He started setting up textile industries, chemical industries, sugar and so on elsewhere. And then not only that, he realized the importance of a nationwide organization for the Indian businessman. So there were small chambers of commerce here and there. Coimbatore, Madras, Bombay, here and there. Bombay we had the Indian Merchant Chamber, which was mostly around the Tatas and some other mill owners. So he set up for the first time a Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, what is called FICCI, in 1927, to act as a spokesman for Indian capitalists. And that, if you see the minutes and of the meetings and the presidential addresses from 1927 onwards, for next 20 years, you will see actually how they are representing the class interests of the Indian capitalists and what are their grievances about the British rule, what are their demands, and so on. Okay, where is the clash happening? Okay, in the economic terms and policy terms and so on. It's a very interesting study. In fact, Professor R D Tata has published an excellent work. I'm going to give you all the references later, where he has gone into the minutes of many such. It's an extremely well researched and annotated book of many of these activities. It's called Nationalism, Imperialism, Nationalism and the Birth of the Indian Capitalist Class, 1920 to 1947. It's a very well researched book. You may or may not agree with much of his analysis or many points in his analysis, but the kind of research he has done and the empirical data he has provided is amazing. It's very useful. Okay, so this is just a background that their ambitions were growing, their power was also growing relatively, the Indian business classes, the large businesses particularly. And very interesting feature is, at that time, they were all united. You cannot think of it today. As a business journalist, I know, I've met all the major groups, and what they talk about the politicians, what they talk about each other is literally unprintable. Whereas publicly they will have and they will praise, they will give 11 out of 10 for the budget and for every government and all that. Okay? But that time they were really united. In fact, at one time, Birlas had more shares in Tata Steel than Tata themselves. Okay? It might surprise you. And many of them were sitting on each other's boards. Birlas were also on Tata's boards. Vishweshwaraya was on the Tata board for 26 years, Tata Steel board. Okay? Keshav Mahindra was on Tata's board also. And so on. So there was a lot of camaraderie and also, sinking in thinking, and there was an attempt to do it also. There was an active attempt to act as a group and put forward common demands and reduce any controversial issues. And put forward one front, one set of demands, both to the Indian National Congress and to the Viceroy. And in fact, there is a whole discussion in the Ardeshir Dalal book on how G D Birla literally during the Roundtable Conference, I think in 1930 or 31, when Gandhiji attended it, okay, that he took a hotel room next to him and whole night tutored him on what to say next on the economic and monetary policy. And Gandhiji told him, I don't know anything economics, you write it and give it to me, I'll say it in the conference tomorrow. Because there is a big clash that was going on the exchange rate that the British had fixed between pound and rupee. And that was very discriminatory and arbitrary. It was hurting Indian industry, and of course it was hurting the whole Indian economy. But the Indian industry said this is unfair, our goods are being taken very cheap and all the imports are very high. There is nothing to do, this exchange rate is arbitrary. So it is an equivalent of Trump tax today. Trump is taxing us through tariffs, right? So that time, the British were taxing us by setting an arbitrary exchange rate. This started in the 20s, right? Because Britain started going bankrupt after the First World War. It became a debtor to America. So all the more it became ferocious in India. The Jallianwala Bagh and all this, because India was absolutely needed now for the survival of British Empire. Because now it has become a debtor nation from a great, empire, superpower. It has become a debtor nation to America. So how to survive? So anything that you can extract from India was very important for them. So at that time, all these kinds of, if you cannot do it with arms, and of course you can do it with force, but you use economic levers to get advantage from India. So one of the things they were doing it was through monetary policy, fixing the exchange rate. So this struggle started between the Indian mill owners and capitalists versus the British. And so at that time, you can say a person who was 7th standard pass or 8th standard pass, like D Birla, not only learned English, but he started writing, he talked to economists and all that, and started writing pamphlets on monetary policy, on the Indian currency and all that. And here, a capitalist from Bombay called Purushottamdas Thakurdas, who was also around the Tatas and all that, but he was an independent, also industrialist and banker. He became a monetary expert and started writing economic monetary policy. He started writing pamphlets on this arbitrary British policy and what should be the currency policy and so on and so forth. And then D Birla even went to the extent of connecting it, because many of these bright Indian graduates, as you know, they used to go to only Cambridge and Oxford at that time. So C.D. Deshmukh, P.C. Mahalanobis, who was already a contemporary of Srinivasa Ramanujan in Cambridge, who had studied physics in Cambridge and then changed over to statistics, right? Loganathan, all these were students of Loganathan and C.D. Deshmukh and others some of the others were students of John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes rated them very highly also as very bright students. And they were back here as administrative officers, ICS officers and so on. So the Indian businessmen were working closely with the Indians who were in the ICS and all that also. They were encouraging them to not only give them scholarships, send them to Cambridge and Oxford and all that, and come back and join the service, and also, work with the nationalist interests, though they are part of the colonial state, even very close to Viceroy and all that. So it is Tatas and Birlas who started a campaign in 1924-25 openly demanding the establishment of Reserve Bank of India. That there should be an institution which will fix the currency and various other things. So the result of this was finally in 34-35, the Reserve Bank of India was established by the British, and in fact Tatas and Birlas were also made part of the directors of the Reserve Bank of India. And by the way, that tradition continues for many years. JRD continued to be on the board, members of the Birla family continued to be on the board, and even today if you see the Reserve Bank board, there are always representatives of the big industry there, along with the deputy governors and some government appointees, etc., some independents. But anyway, so that was the result of the clash, the birth of the Reserve Bank of India itself, which was because of on the monetary policy issue, and how are you going to fix the exchange rate, etc. So I already mentioned this, birth of Reserve Bank and then the planning committee, National Planning Committee under Jawaharlal Nehru. So the idea that there should be government intervention, there should be government and the businessmen together making a plan for the development of India was embedded in the Indian politics and business from 1930s actually. So if anybody tells you planning commission and what happened later was cooked up by some leftist this in Moscow or something like that. No. It was done very much in India, in the leadership of International Congress and in the headquarters of the, Tatas like Bombay House and Birlas and so on, so forth, which I'll illustrate to you how the Bombay Plan talks exactly about this whole setup which came into being post-independence. So, D Birla, but because this planning committee was not going anywhere, which was established by Netaji in 38, in 43, he approached D Tata and said, now all the businessmen that Congress leaders are also in the jail. So now, and even though the British government has not guaranteed giving independence after the war also, it's just a vague promise that we'll consider it post-war and all that. We might give you dominion status, all these things was going on. Right? Whereas the Congress leaders were saying, before the war, you give us independence and all that. That's how the Quit India movement came in. So they were all put in the jail. So at that time, these people literally assumed leadership. Okay, on the one hand, Jinnah used that situation to become the favorites of the Muslim League and Jinnah to become the favorites of British by supporting the war and so on, and let all the Congress leaders are in jail. On the other hand, the businessmen, they took the leadership, and then D Birla approached JRD and said, let's formulate a national plan, and I will make sure I'll also get representatives of the capitalists from various parts of India. So he brought in Kasturbhai Lalbhai as a representative of the Ahmedabad millionaires, Lala Sriram as a representative of the Delhi businessman. Lala Sriram is the founder of the DCM group, which was at that time the biggest group in Delhi. Okay. Then A.D. Shroff, Ardeshir Dalal, Purushottamdas Thakurdas, Mathai, all from Bombay, associated with Tatas and as well as independent. And one was even an advisor to Viceroy. Ardeshir Dalal was an ICS officer after his retirement. He was a finance member for the Viceroy's Executive Council. So, but he was also a director of Tata Sons. Okay? So, all these 8 people represented the business community of India. And D Birla was in close touch with all the Congress leaders, including Manmohan Singh and Savarkar even, and Vallabhbhai Patel, and of course Motilal Nehru. Motilal Nehru, in fact, the biography written by Mehta says that Motilal Nehru, when that Nehru Committee report, which was put forward in 1928, which is a famous report, which became the foundation, you can say, for the Indian Constitution later. Because the British had challenged, who are we going to give you can't even write your own constitution, who are we going to pass the power on? So the challenge was taken up and the Motilal Nehru Committee was set up and they came up with the report. And if you look at the committee recommendations, many of the important elements of the present-day Indian constitution come from that 1928 report of Motilal Nehru. And the biographer says that Motilal Nehru continuously consulted D Birla, showed him the drafts of the committee report also for his inputs. So the enmeshing of the business interest and the unity of the Indian business class at that time was unprecedented. Okay? And that is what, and at the same time, when somebody was talking about socialism and expropriation and here and there, leftists in Congress were talking about it, and some Bombay businessmen were getting worried, and they wrote a letter to D Birla. It is the published letters correspondence of Birla that wrote to D Birla saying, what is this going on in Congress? They are talking about socialism and expropriating our property and all that, and so maybe we should form our own party, a capitalist party. So he says, you are a stupid man. He said, if rich people go and defend property, private property, nobody will listen to us. Let Congress leaders and let a fakir like Mahatma Gandhi defend private property, he says, in that letter. It's a published letter, right, written to Bombay Cabinet. Okay? And also he says, don't worry about some leftists saying this and that within the Congress. It's good that Congress doesn't get split into left and right and center. Let it be the umbrella organization. We can deal with the United Congress leadership rather than multiple, things. This is another letter. Okay? So, very, you can say strategically, cleverly Indian businessmen also operated with the Congress leadership. Congress leadership was also very much embedded. I mean, after all, till their death, Jawaharlal Nehru used to write to JRD saying, addressing him as J-E-H, Jahangir, you know. Jahangir, J was a pet name, which only very close people to JRD used to call him J. And all Nehru's letters were addressed to J. And JRD's letters to Nehru, if you see, they are all published, by the way. It says they call him Jawar Bhai or just Bhai, you know. So they are really very close friends, close strategic thinkers, you know, and had, you can say, though each had their own personalities, idiosyncrasies, and you can even say ideological tilts, but they had some common purpose. Okay? To what to do in independent India. They were already talking about what to do in independent India when they were still under British rule. Okay? That is what is interesting, the far-sightedness of this, on which Dr. Manmohan Singh commented in 2004. I'll read out excerpts from that. So all these people got together, and these were the authors of the new plan which was published in 1944, part 1, and part 2 was published in 45. JRD, D Birla, Lala Sriram from Delhi, DCM Group, Kasturbhai Lalbhai from Ahmedabad, Purushottamdas Thakurdas from Mumbai, who was a banker, industrialist, etc., and also an economist who was writing pamphlets on the monetary problems, and which even Keynes was appreciating. Shroff, again, banker, economist, and by the way, Shroff was one of the delegates. Indians could not participate in the founding of the World Bank and IMF in Bretton Woods, in New Hampshire, in 1944, where IMF and World Bank came into being. In that foundational meeting, there was an Indian delegation, but it was unofficial because India was still a colony, and Shroff was one of them. And in fact, the minutes of those discussions are very interesting, that actually they even pushed for C.D. Deshmukh to be the first IMF managing director. Okay, C.D. Deshmukh, who had already become the first Indian RBI governor. Chintamani Deshmukh, who later also became finance minister in the Nehru government and all that. Became RBI governor in 1942. That also Tatas and Birlas had pushed. They said we want an Indian in the RBI governor. Before that, all after 34 to 42 were all Englishmen. Okay, so, and Shroff was part of that delegation who lobbied, not only attended Bretton Woods and tried to argue the case to change something or the other, both in the IMF and in the some things, even though India was weak and poor and a colony, they were powerful enough, their arguments were powerful enough that Americans were making fun of the British delegation. Your colony seems to be more powerful than you, the kind of arguments they are putting forward. Okay? And all this are recorded. I'll give you the references for that. I'm not telling the story. Okay? So Shroff attended the Bretton Woods. Ardeshir Dalal, ICS, also director of Tata Sons, and also Viceroy's advisor. These are all the authors of the Bombay Plan. These 8 people wrote the Bombay Plan. Okay? JRD, D Birla, Lala Sriram, Kasturbhai Lalbhai, Shroff, Ardeshir Dalal, and John Mathai. John Mathai was not a businessman, he was an economist, but he also became the first railway minister and then the finance minister in the Nehru's government in 48 to 50. Okay? So, they played a major role in the 40s and also in the independent India later. These were the authors of this plan. And this is the first page, contents page of part 1 of that plan. See, these are the list of the authors and these are the contents. And this is more a vision statement type of thing. What kind of economy we want, how to deal with the poverty and various things like that. Okay? After I finish, we will get. Then this is the second part which was published in 1945. Okay? Just within 10 or 11 months. One person is missing, Ardeshir Dalal, because now he had been inducted into the Viceroy's Council. So he could not sit sit and write this thing here. So temporarily he went out of the authorship. He was the author of the first part. In the second part he went out of it. So there is one less in this. But most interesting part of this part 2, is this. Distribution of wealth and distribution in general and the role of the state. That means what should the government do? What should the state do? Where should it invest? What should be public sector? What should be licensing? What should be state's role in the economy? Right? Today we call it Nehru socialism, we got liberation in 91, 1947, Nehru did this, and then Indira Gandhi did that. All kinds of stupid things are written by all kinds of people who are too lazy to actually go and look at the documents and the evolution of the both history and the policy. So if you look at this, the biggest businessmen and their representatives said that the state should intervene in the economy. And how exactly, we'll see next. What all the state should do. Controls. State should control production, state should control distribution, state should control consumption, means even pricing and all that. Investment means what should be invested, where and how much. State should do it. So there is no so-called market economics and laissez-faire capitalism here. Straightforward, a collaboration between private capital and the state. Okay, proposed by the private capitalists. Not by some socialists or communists or Moscow or anybody else. Okay? Why? We'll come to that. How this helped them and helped, what was their outlook, strategic outlook. Foreign trade and exchange. How states should control foreign trade. How foreign goods should not be allowed inside. How foreign capital should not be allowed inside. Okay? That's why we had to go around in ambassador cars till Maruti came in. Because they decided it. Because actually they went and both GRD and D Birla went to Washington and in London to woo all the investors in 1944-45. And they gave press conferences there from London and from Washington. And neither the British investors nor the American investors ready to come and invest in India, number one. Number two, they said if we will sell our cars and everything else to you, but we will see, depending on the size of the market, we might invest. But if we invest, it will be our company. These people said, no, you give us the technology. Even today we are saying the same thing, right? Atmanirbhar, make in India means what? You give us the technology, we'll make it. Right? And still, 80 years later, we are saying the same thing. We're still the same places. So they went and said there that no, you give us the technology, we'll make it. They said no, we'll not give you automobile technology and we will not give you aerospace technology. These people thought just like, we brought textile machinery and made textile mills here, jute machinery and made jute mills here, and some chemicals and all that. So maybe we can develop advanced, aerospace and, the automobile and all these other cutting edge, those days cutting edge engineering and other things. Electronics had not yet come into such a big thing at that time. That we'll do all that in India. With bought engineers, bought machinery, and we train our people and then we will make it. Just like we made cloth and jute and other things. But the British and Americans were not stupid. They knew the capability of both the Indian entrepreneurs and Indians to learn the technology and do one better than them. So they refused. They said, no, we are going to sell our goods to you. And if there is a good enough market, we will invest in manufacturing there in India. But then it will be our company. These people said, these minutes are there, okay? Discussion where Tatas, Birlas, Kirloskars and various Singhanias are sitting together, discussing with the Ford representatives and saying that you license the technology to us and we will make the automobile industry. And Vishweshwarya made this plan. Vishweshwarya is the one who made this plan. There will be Indian automobile industry owned by all these capitalists, not one. We'll all put money together, our expertise together and build an automobile industry. This is 1930s May. Then in the 1944-45 when they went, that actually these people said, okay, if that is the case, we'll give you minority 10%, 20% equity will give you, rest will be owned by us. The Americans and British refused. They said it will be 100% owned by foreigners. These people said, we have just come out of we are just getting rid of colonialism, we don't want to be recolonized by you. We want to own it. They said, we'll give you ambassador card. That is a Vauxhall model. Vauxhall was a British automobile company. It was already discarded model. They said, we'll give you that. So Birla said, okay. And that's why for the next 40 odd years, we were going around in ambassador cars. Pakistanis were going around in Toyotas. Okay? Pakistan looked like a modern economy. Good roads, foreign cars and all that. Because they never thought of building the industrial base. These people said, no, we will learn slowly. Instead of imported trucks, we will learn that Tata said, Delco said, now we will build the trucks now. First we will take it from Mercedes-Benz. So remember, old Tata trucks used to have Mercedes things. It was called Tata Mercedes. Then the Mercedes dropped and it became Tata trucks. And today Tata Motors, of course, is one of the biggest truck makers in the world. Okay, so Indian industry strategy was different. But the foreigners were not ready for that. They are not ready for it now also. They were not ready for it that time also. Okay, so there was a cost involved in that. Cost involved was that Indian consumers, you can say, suffered. We didn't get the best cars. We didn't get the cheapest cars and so on because they put 300% tax. That's what Trump is shouting about, right? 300% tax you are putting, you're not allowing our cars, you're not allowing our Harley Davidsons and all that, right? But this is a policy from 1940s, right from the Tata-Birla Plan. So, high tariffs, protected market, no foreign capital unless, it comes as a loan from the World Bank to the sovereign government. Not a loan taken, so let the government borrow the money, distribute it through ICICI, IDBI, IFCI as project financing to the Indian entrepreneurs. Not that individual capitalists will try to go and negotiate because their negotiating power will be less, whereas the sovereign can get better terms. Okay? So, a whole architecture of finance, of capital, of technology, of production, markets was developed for independent India. So, then control of production, see who should get license for what? The whole licensing system proposed here. Okay? Of course, for the public there was a discussion about license Raj, permit Raj and all that. But the license Raj and permit Raj is being proposed here. There should be industrial licensing. Okay? Control will see. I am not going to read it out. In fact, you can download the thing. I'm just trying to highlight the things. You can download the whole plan and read it. I'm just taking out extracts. How strictly they argued for state intervention in everything. In investment, you can't even raise your own share capital unless the controller of capital issues allows it, CCI, which was only abolished in 1992 after the Manmohan Singh reforms. Okay? It is proposed here. Similarly, all sorts of things. Backward area, there should be some distribution of industry, you should give tax concessions, subsidies for industry in backward area. All this deficit financing, print money, let there be inflation, though it is harmful to the poor. They write all this. But we need the money. If we grow fast enough, if we develop fast enough, then our tax revenues will also increase and it will become a self-financing growth. This was a Keynesian economics. In fact, many other governments, including the so-called capitalist governments like Britain and even in the United States under Roosevelt and all that, all these things were being done. Partly influenced by the Soviet Union, partly by the crisis that had happened right after the crash of 1929-30. The stock market crash and the whole anarchy that went into the markets. So, planning and state intervention now was being accepted by every government in the world. It had nothing to do with socialism and Soviet Union. Okay? So, they were very comfortable with that. So, similarly, investment control, CCI. Trade and exchange will be subjected to control to such extent as may be required for conserving foreign exchange. So if all of us went abroad with $8 in our pockets, okay, till 91, 92, it is because of this. This is we went to conserve foreign exchange. So don't open up, and even the exchange rate, it should be controlled by the RBI. It is not market determined. Nothing is market determined here. In this whole proposal, nothing is market determined. But there will be a space for private industry. It's not that everything will be state-owned, which continue. And there is a long discussion on agriculture, modernization of agriculture, seeds, farm sizes, all sorts of land reforms and so on and so forth. Okay? I am not going to go into that. This is the most interesting thing, I will come back to this. It says, in future, when private capital is strong enough, some of these public assets may be handed over back to for private capital. Which is what we talk about as Manmohan Singh's reforms and privatization of public sector. First they are saying build public sector with taxpayers' money, and then they are saying when we are strong enough to hand it across. So even when Manmohan, part of the, you can say, Manmohan Singh reforms, the logic of it is being proposed here. Section 41, state ownership. It says, if later on private finance is prepared to take over these industries, state ownership may be replaced by private ownership. This is what we call today liberalization, privatization and all that now. But it is essential in the public interest that state should retain effective control over them. Still, even after the privatization, still you should have some control over this. Anyway. So, what was the impact? This is Dr. Manmohan Singh in a public speech which is available on the PMO website in 2004. He made it, I think, with Asokan, one of the large business group meeting, where he mentioned his Tata-Birla plan, and he says, as a student of economics in the 1950s and later as a practitioner in government, I was greatly impressed by the Bombay Plan of 1944. When we read it today, nearly 60 years later, in 2004 he is saying, 60 years later, we see how relevant many of the central propositions of the Bombay Plan remain. In those days, it was an unprecedented document. It is worthy of emphasis that nowhere in the developing world had a group of businessmen come together to draw up such a long-term plan for a country. And then he says, the Bombay Plan laid great emphasis on public investment in social and economic infrastructure in both rural and urban areas. It emphasized the importance of agrarian reform and agricultural research in setting up educational institutions and modern financial system, which later became IITs, IIMs, etc., etc. Okay? Above all, it defined the framework for India's transition from agrarian feudalism to industrial capitalism. This is Dr. Manmohan Singh's words. But capitalism that is humane, okay, that invests in the welfare and skills of the working people, which is what he used to call as capitalism with a human face and all that, when he was the Prime Minister. Then he said, in many ways, this is the most telling thing. He says, in many ways, it encapsulated what all subsequent plans have tried to achieve. Because Bombay Plan only talks about 3 plans. First 5-year plan, second 5-year plan, and tentative outline of the third 5-year plan. But he is saying all subsequent 5-year plans were guided by the Bombay Plan. Not just 3 till 1960 or something. Okay? And he is a man who spent more than 50 years in the service of the Indian economy. So we can take his word for it. President Obama used to call him my guru and all that. That all the G7 leaders called him to give them a lecture when with the global financial crisis to understand what is happening. Dr. Singh tell us. So he gave them a tutorial, and all of them sat and listened carefully and asked him questions to what is happening in this financial crisis and what can be the way out. This is what Obama said. Dr. Manmohan Singh didn't come out and say, boast about it. Obama said this. Okay? So that is a man who is evaluating Bombay Plan and its significance. Now this is just the epilogue, I can say. that however, with all these developments, by 80s, many of the Indian capitalist groups had become strong enough and they wanted to spread abroad because a business, to stay where you are, you have to run. That is a law of business, law of capitalism. So if you want to, you have to continually grow. To grow, if your market is not enough, you have to find markets elsewhere. And if you have capital which you cannot employ here, you have to employ it somewhere else where it is more profitable. Today we are talking about how there is FDI, more FDI going out of India than coming in. Why? Because Indian capitalists are finding in some other regions investment there is more profitable than investing in India today, for whatever reasons. I am not going to get into it now. Okay? So, capital, this is what globalized capitalism looks like, right? That is fungible. So capital can cross boundaries, of course trillions of dollars cross with pressing the enter button on a laptop nowadays from traders and all sorts of things in the international market. So they wanted to go out now. They wanted to look for new markets. And already Birla started it in the 80s. They were the first to go out and start investing in Indonesia and Thailand and so on in Southeast Asia. So already a movement started that we have had enough of this, we are not getting very far. And whatever little the playoff they did between India and Soviet Union, Soviet Union and US, which came to be called as non-alignment, they tried to get good terms from both, whichever suited them. So if Soviet Union built the first oil refinery, 1961 in the Koyali oil refinery for Indian oil, next one, Chevron did it, and somebody else did it, Phillips did it, and so on. So it is not some ideological thing. Okay, they are trying to get the best terms either from Soviet Union or from the United States or any West European power, depending on that, right? Bokaro was built by the Soviet Union, Bilai was built by Soviet Union, something else was built by the Germans, Durgapur was built by the British technology and so on and so forth. So it is not something ideological, they wanted to get the best terms. Okay, even today we are trying to do that, right? We are saying, our market is so big that gives us a leverage. As consumers, we are large enough market that it gives us a leverage. So it is the same thing which they were trying earlier, during the era of the Cold War, playing one against the other. So in the 80s they realized Soviet Union is collapsing, is weakening. Already Soviet Union, in the 80s, the rise of Gorbachev coincides with the Soviet Union retreating from Afghanistan and so many other things. So economy was collapsing, its power was collapsing, imperial power we can say, the power to project its power elsewhere. It was coming down. So at that time, they had to reset. They had to open it up to Western. They had to go to Western markets. They had to get Western capital. So they said, we want to come to you. When the World Bank and IMF were saying it from 60s, open up your markets, open up your markets. So the foreign markets, foreign finance, international finance, welcomed it. But then they said, you are welcome to come here, but sir, open your house also. If you want to come to our house, you open your house also. So the reforms which were implemented by Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh were not dictated by Washington. Because Washington had been saying it from 60s. When Mrs. Gandhi went and met Lyndon Johnson and all that in 60s, and they told her, McNamara and Lyndon Johnson said, devalue the rupee, etc. 50% devaluation took place. In 66, from 5 rupees a dollar, it became 8 rupees a dollar. Okay? And it created havoc. And then they had promised so many $1 billion, which they just cancelled. So Mrs. Gandhi was caught. She didn't know what to do. She had followed this thing, she believed their promise. And then the Americans backed out from giving the money, which they were supposed to give World Bank money for various things. They just backed out of it. Okay, so anyway, so the thing is, these reforms, that balance of payments crisis in 91, so these reforms, that's why they were written down much earlier. If you read Montek Singh Ahluwalia's autobiographical book called Backstage, he openly talks about it, but otherwise it was a rumor and gossip earlier. It was called the M note, a note written by Montague. But they didn't want to author it, so it was called M note. Everybody discussed it from 87-88 inside the government. What should be done? So 91 was a crisis which they said don't waste a crisis. Because that crisis could have been handled by going to IMF, no problem. Pakistan has done it 25 times. India also could have done it. They go to IMF to do balance of payments issue. But they said that this is a time, use this crisis to bring all these reforms also. So it's a historically and factually wrong thing to say Washington dictated liberalization. The liberalization, of course, Washington was talking about it from 60s. But it was Indian business which was now ready, at least the big business. Some people had questions about it. Itna jaldi mat karo, pace of liberalization, the so-called Bombay Club, Rahul Bajaj is saying various things, all that, okay? But in general, capital was much cheaper if you borrowed abroad. Indian interest rates were much higher. So why not go to GDRs, ADRs, borrow from the European banks, American banks, much lower rates, 3%, 4% rates, here it will give 8% minimum, even the large capitalists, right? Small capitalists have to pay 11%, 13%, whatever. So if you are, even if you give some extra, all this commissions for the investment bankers and all that to arrange a loan, 3-4%, what is the big huge difference? No? So they wanted foreign capital, access to capital, and along with it markets. So that is what was the driving force for the liberalization program, in my view. Okay, you can call it your opinion, but this is my opinion. And then, of course, the result of that is we are seeing today. Today, Indian businessmen have invested, according to Reserve Bank, $700 billion abroad. $700 billion have been invested abroad by Indian businessmen. These are Reserve Bank figures. Okay? They are getting, and they have bought a lot of industries, manufacturing, set up services, all sorts of things also. So today, in the 21st century, we are seeing they are in the top 5 global players in cement, in aluminum, in steel, in two-wheelers, trucks, tractors, polyester, plastics, tea, IT services, generic drugs, vaccines, telecom services, and so on. So globalization was driven by them to their old aspiration of becoming global businessmen, which we were talking about in the colonial days, you can say coming down to that. Okay, so you can see why Manmohan Singh's comment on this far-sighted businessman is important. Otherwise, in the 60s, Pakistan had a much higher growth rate than us. World Bank had written papers and were calling Taiwanese, Singaporeans and South Koreans to come to Pakistan to study how Pakistan is growing. Can you imagine this? In the 60s, in Ayub Khan's days. Why? Because Pakistan was following the World Bank prescriptions fully. Open this, open that, import this, and so on. These people didn't do it. And today you see where is Pakistan, for the 25th time it has gone to IMF. Right? And after that 91, India has never gone back to IMF. And now from $1 billion it has built up a reserve of about $700 billion and so on and so forth. At least 11 months of imports it can finance and so on. So you may not be a great manufacturing power like Japan, South Korea or China. Okay? But you have done reasonably well. Much more than, but it has been done through a planned, systematic way, with a vision. Now, who has benefited from it most? Of course, the big business has benefited most. Of course, the inequality has increased. Okay? So, those are separate issues. So, who benefits from which family, which policy is a separate discussion. I am just talking about the vision of these businessmen who created this Bombay Plan 80 years ago, which gave impetus to the growth of the Indian economy. So, calling it, it's okay for some newspaper or some podcaster to call this socialism, that capitalism, we got liberation in 91, we got liberation in 2014 and so on. Okay? That doesn't concern economists. That is slogans, that is polemics, that is politics. Economists are interested in hard data, trends and what is happening on the ground. If you look at it that way, you can see it is independent of who is Prime Minister, who is Finance Minister, who is Finance Secretary and so on and so forth in a sense. Economics has its own logic. And the policy, if a particular policy is more or less followed, and by the way, every party, every United Front and everything else which came to power in between also have followed the same policies. While in opposition they can say whatever they want. Right? I mean, even the NDA opposed everything which is now implementing. It opposed Aadhaar, it opposed the nuclear deal, it opposed GST and so on. Today they are implementing it. Why? Because they are all in the interest of the growth of consensus within the business class about what is good for their growth, and their logic is if they grow then India will grow. Now people might dispute that, but there is a logic there. So here I'll close my talk, and these are the references I just want you to highlight. Life and Death of D Birla by Meda Puraisia, I already mentioned. Imperialism, Nationalism and the Making of the Indian Capitalist Class by Aditya Mukherjee. Who owns India? Ashok Mehta. Remember, he was also deputy chairman of the Planning Commission at one time, Rajya Sabha member, he was a Socialist Party leader. He in 1938 wrote this, who owns India, and he drew tree diagrams on which group controls which mill and which industry and so on. It's amazing work. It was later published in 1940-41, reprinted in 48-49. Who owns India? Okay? Goras and Basics by Onkar Goswami. Here it traces this whole development of the entrepreneurship which came to be called as managing agency system. Then, report of the National Planning Committee 1938. The Planning Committee under Jawaharlal Nehru's thing which was formed by Subhash Chandra Bose could not meet, as I mentioned to you. So, in 49 finally they published some of the discussions which they had. So it's not a proper plan or a report. And already the Bombay Plan had preempted it. So they didn't even bother to now formulate another one. Because even in that there were representatives of the business. Okay? Representatives of many leading businessmen are also in that planning committee also. In the Congress planning committee also. But anyway, but that report is available. Whatever they published is available on the net. Then Bombay Plan by Sanjay Baur, I already showed you the cover. Tryst with Prosperity, again I showed you the cover. Then this Backstage, autobiographical memoirs of Montek Singh Ahluwalia, very interesting. What went on in the 80s, 70s, 90s, and later also in the Planning Commission, etc. Imagining India, this is Nandan Nilekani's his view of what should be done in India now. So, after the interesting, the Bombay Plan, you can say gave the plan for India. Okay? After that, where is the new plan for 21st century? We don't have. Only thing we have is Dr. Manmohan Singh's speech in the 92 budget. When he presented the budget, the first liberalization budget in 92, the speech where he talked about why we are doing this liberalization and opening up the economy and all that. That is the only document we have to study. There is no vision put forward by Indian businessmen after this Bombay Plan with some one united plan. Then, now recently, Nandan Nilekani has written, Chandrasekharan has written, Raghuram Rajan has written, from their own angles, various kinds of vision statements. But today's capitalist class in India hasn't put forward one view on how we should go to whatever you want to call it. You want to call it Viksit Bharat, fine. Or you want to call it something else, fine. But what is the plan for it? What we should be doing and all that? And unfortunately, the so-called think tank setup called Niti Aayog in the place of Planning Commission also has not really come up with that. You are look for Viksit Bharat actual documentation, statement, goals, quantitative thing. There is nothing that exists that I have found. I'll be very happy if somebody can provide me one. And part 1, part 2 of the Bombay Plan, again I am giving it to you. Thank you very much.
really listening to lectures in economics and so on. It was really quite dazzling and very lucid and engrossing. So that's the best lecture that I have attended, I think, related to economics and highlighting a very important and seminal period, which, as you said, has very far-reaching ramifications. And I think it's very important to take stock, as you've done, and point to the relevance of also, even at this stage, as you said, we need that kind of thinking and planning and so on. And so it was really quite a sweep of ideas and issues there, and I turn it over to the audience for their comments.
What is holding the NITI Aayog to develop Vikasit Bharat plan?
You have to ask the NITI Aayog. Okay? So how are you going to come out with, as a nation, our intellectual capital, our problems going to solve? Nobody is going to solve our problems. No model, no copying anybody is going to work here. Not China, not America, not somebody else, some Scandinavia or something like that. So, are the Indian intellectuals, and include the businessmen in that, and everybody else, and farmers and everybody, can we come out with a plan for the future of India? That is a challenge for us. Forget the politicians and political parties and so on. Because they are not there for power. Okay? They are not necessarily, incidentally, if also something good happens to it, despite the government. In fact, there are a number of people who have written about how IT industry in India grew despite the government and so on. In fact, all this, actually, what we today call knowledge economy and innovation and this and that, all that is despite the government and despite the monopolies. Right? And the same thing happened in the United States, in the Silicon Valley also. I studied it in great detail. I went to lots of venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, and I've written books on the developments in Silicon Valley. Okay? Both as entrepreneurs and as technology. But the point is, we have a very strange ecosystem. You can't call it capitalist. You cannot call it feudal. I don't know what to call this. You have elements of feudalism, you have elements of monopoly capitalism, and the middle and small industry struggling to survive in this thing, and that is what provides jobs. That's where even the innovations come from. Whether you call them startups or whether you call them small businesses, and nobody gives them capital. No bank will give them capital. These startups and government cannot be venture capitalists. If any government says, I'm going to start, I will start up India and this and that, it's a slogan. In fact, when Pramod Mahajan became the first IT minister, we all business journalists and IT industry used to ask, we did have an IT ministry and we grew. And why do we need an IT ministry now? He was the first IT minister. So same way, can we have a ministry for innovation? And people will talk nonsense who have never innovated in their life. They have never innovated a process, never innovated a product. They will all give you lectures on innovation. So, but it is the Indian brain, we have to come together, keep our ideological, that's all other baggage outside. We have this problem, at least, even the problem definition there will be diverse opinion on that, what is the problem. But then, at least if we start sitting together and talking about it, both identifying the problem is half the problem, and then how to go about solving it, what are our limitations, what are the possibilities. This churn has to happen. We cannot expect political parties and the system to come out with it. That's my thinking from whatever, 70 decades of my life. There are people who have spent more and more experience, they will know better. I am not a cynic. I am not saying nothing is possible, because wherever I have reported the most positive stories of innovation as a business journalist, I used to go looking around all the national laboratories, atomic energy, space, CSIR labs, private industry, their R&D labs, from pharma to engineering to everything else, except the recent, after I retired, recent developments in the deep tech startups and all that. I know some of them. For example, I was at the founding ceremony of the most successful deep tech startup in India, which is Tejas Networks. And that was 2000-2001. Along with Deshesh Pandey, I was there when they lit the lamp. And today it is the most successful, data communication and deep tech thing we are proud of, which is listed also. But after that, recent things I don't know. But if you can come, spend some time doing this kind of churn, I think we'll achieve more than sitting in these TV debates or following all that WhatsApp university debates and social media debates and all that.
I just want to
Any
add.
other questions?
I just want to add to what is says. You're absolutely right. The problem is if you look at the Niti Aayog people, most of them come from the top 10% elite. They are also live only in big cities. They have English medium education. They have very little idea of how the rest of the country lives. Okay, and the issue is that the biggest chunks of the Indian economy are in the smaller towns and villages. The agriculture, the partnership and proprietorship sector, together 2/3 of the Indian economy. And as you said, those guys are always struggling. The entire capital has gone towards all these big companies. This is basically India suffering from what Dr. Y. Reddy, former Reserve Bank governor, called the tyranny of the 10%. He called it the tyranny of the 10%. The top 10% dominate, they get everything.
I have gone to Jamnagar refinery, which is the largest refinery in the world of Reliance. Okay, there are hardly 400, 500 people managing that largest refinery. Because everything is computer controlled. There are distributed control systems, and now of course you have Internet of Things and all these things. All sensors talking to each other. And 30 years ago, I went to a cement factory of Tata Chemicals in Mithapur. 30 years ago, and 500,000 ton cement factory was being run by 35 people. The labor was only like in carrying the bags which were bagged in a machine to load it in a truck. So this is what large industry does. It is very necessary. I am not at all saying small is beautiful and that's going to solve the problems. Not at all. Far from it. Large scale industry is very much required. But if your entire capital is going there, state support and subsidies is going there, then what is happening to the sectors which are creating employment, and also being productive and innovative? There is no support for them. They are dying to get 11%, 13% loan from the banks, and then they have to struggle with GST, EST, 100 things. This inspector, that inspector. The inspector Raj affects them. The inspector Raj never affected these people. Okay. I have seen when I was a journalist, when all this Enron business was going on, writing about it, so I went to meet the Maharashtra Power Secretary to discuss what is happening, because they were talking about renegotiating and all that. And the Power Secretary, who is supposed to control the entire power sector of Maharashtra, a call came to him. The moment he heard who was on the other side, he stood up and took the call. Whole conversation he was standing up. Yes sir, yes sir, yes sir. Then I wonder, who is he talking to? He was talking to one senior official from Tata Power. Not even Ratan Tata or anybody, okay? This power secretary who is supposed to be controlling the entire power sector is standing up to receive that call. Once I was asking, some board members, that in a board meeting, Mr. Malya and Mr. Another person were discussing whose private jet is faster. That I go from Bombay to Bangalore in 40 minutes or 45 minutes. Okay? And in all these private companies, 30 to 35% is still owned by the government. By SBI, UTI, LIC. So I asked them, what do their representatives do on the board? They said, they take the sitting money, drink the chai, eat samosa and go. And if the finance secretary says vote like this, they vote like that. That's it.
So thank you, and I must say that also that NIAS is itself funded by R D Tata, so it was I think nice and important for us in terms of the historiography, also for Institute to hear of his other landmark contributions. So thank you very much for the insightful talk and for your participation today. Thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to engaging further in these interesting themes.